Are we?
I think my internet went down for a moment there and I got booted off.
The peril of working
Sorry
from.
about that, everyone. I'm not sure if we got into Measure QQ yet.
I'm just going to start from the top again, just in case we didn't, and make sure that everyone has it.
The joys of Zooming and Wi-Fi and working from home. I'm sure I'm not the only one experiencing these struggles periodically.
Yeah. So starting over with Measure QQ, this one touches on youth voting in the election of the school board director in Oakland. So if it passes, the city council would be able to then pass a subsequent law that would allow 16 and 17-year-olds to vote for the school board director. It's important to know on this one, the city council put this measure on the ballot. So even though they have to pass a law down the road, it seems extremely likely that that would happen. This one, though, is outside of our housing and workforce and labor issue areas, so we don't have a position on it.
Got it. Well, I think we'll go ahead and move on then to Oakland Measure RR.
Yeah, so Measure RR deals with the cap on fines for city law and city ordinance violations. So right now, those fines are capped at $1,000. And the issue there is that for certain activities, especially illegal dumping, that $1,000 fine is not a particularly strong incentive to prevent people from participating in that illegal behavior. So Measure RR would get rid of that $1,000 cap, which has actually been in place since 1968 and hasn't been changed. The city council would then meet in a public hearing and decide on a new cap that would most likely be higher to get more of a deterrent effect on breaking some of these city laws. Again, though, this one is outside of our housing and workforce and labor domain, so we don't actually have a specific position on this law or this ballot measure.
Yep. Thanks so much for the summary. Again, we're covering in more detail the measures that have a close nexus to our issue areas, which are housing and workforce and labor, which is why we dove in so deep on Measure W and Measure Z. You're welcome to ask questions about any of the measures. However, we'll be able to give a greater level of detail and more expertise on the ones that have a close issue area nexus and where we've taken a position. So we're going to move on to another measure in Oakland for which we don't have a position, which is Oakland Measure S1.
Yeah, so Oakland Measure S1 deals with oversight of the Oakland Police Department. So 4 years ago in 2016, Oakland voters opted to create the Police Commission, which would have some oversight responsibilities for the police department. This measure would basically give that police commission more powers and would also create another oversight body. So specifically, this would mean that the commissions that are charged with overseeing the police department can now hire independent lawyers. Right now, city government actually has a big say in the lawyers that these oversight bodies can hire, and there's a feeling that it might create a bit of a conflict of interest, doesn't allow for the deep investigation and oversight needed. The Oakland Police Chief would also be required now to respond to requests from the oversight panels. And as I mentioned, this actually creates another investigative body. So this is the Office of Inspector General that will sit outside of the police department, and it will investigate and audit the police department's actions and budget. It also takes over monitoring of the federal settlement that stemmed from the Ryder scandal several years ago. So Megan mentioned that we're not taking a position on this one, and I just want to give a little bit more information on why we came to that conclusion on this, because it's really important, for us to all recognize that issues that affect the police, while maybe it's not directly a housing or a workforce and labor issue, have deep intersections with both of those policy areas. It's clear that over-policing makes it difficult for people to find a home and a job. And this is something that we take pretty seriously at TechEquity. The issue with the local ballot measures dealing with police oversight this year is just that we don't have the policy experience and kind of knowledge to really get a good in-depth take on these measures. And so while we feel that it's very important that we uplift that fact that housing and workforce and labor are deeply affected by police issues. We also want to make sure that we don't say something that is out of step with the advocates who are doing the work on this issue in particular. So that's why we're not making a position on this one, but we definitely would encourage you to take a look at some of these other groups' positions on these. And actually at the end, we have a set of resources for you to get more information on the ballot, and that's included in there.
Yeah, thanks so much for lifting that up, Yaniv. There are many trusted organizations and partners who have far more experience and expertise on these areas. So we'll point you to those, like Yaniv said, at the end of the webinar and also in the follow-up email. So for now, we're going to go ahead and move on to Oakland Measure Y.
Yep. So Oakland Measure Y is the last Oakland measure on the ballot, and that we'll be talking about today. And this one deals with borrowing money to upgrade school buildings in the Oakland Public Schools. So this would finance maintenance, repair, and upgrades of school facilities. And the way that this works is the school district would borrow $735 million and then pay it back over 30 years with interest. And to fund those repayments, there would be an additional property tax in Oakland of 0.05 to 0.06%, which is a pretty small amount.
Thanks. Well, now it's time to move on to Berkeley measures. And we've got a few in Berkeley for which we do have some policy expertise and some strong opinions. So Berkeley folks, it is your time. But again, Oakland folks and other East Bay folks, please don't tune out because you have friends who live in Berkeley and you want to pass on this information to them, I'm sure. So just a quick overview. As we said, there's some measures for which we have policy expertise and will take a position. You can see those highlighted in the sort of brighter blue color. Those that are in the deep navy color, we will give a summary, but we won't do as much of an in-depth chat about them, just to give you a preview of what we have ahead in Berkeley. So let's kick things off with Measure GG. To talk about transportation network companies, probably better known as Lyft and Uber. Take it away, Yaniv.
And yeah, just a programming note, we're going to go through the three measures that we're taking a position on first, and then I'm going to give you that overview information on the other five. So starting out with Measure GG, which is a tax on ride hailing, ride sharing, Uber and Lyft, depending on which terminology you like to use. It would charge 50 cents for a single ride and 25 cents for a shared ride. That begins in Berkeley. This would go up over time, indexed to inflation, and it's expected to raise about $900,000 annually. Also important to know, rides in wheelchair accessible vehicles are exempt, as are rides that are paid for by Medicare or Medi-Cal. And in the past, cities like San Francisco have passed taxes on these companies and their rides, and we supported them, and we likewise strongly support Measure GG. We think it's really important to put a tax on some of these rides so that we can kind of recapture some of the costs that these rides kind of impose on all of society. And there's really three main areas that those fall into. So one is the effect on public transportation. There's a growing body of research that shows that these Uber and Lyft rides have actually reduced ridership on public transportation. And a big issue there is a lot of public transportation funding comes from fares from riders. And so when that ridership drops, their fare revenue drops. And a lot of the ways that they respond to that is with service cuts. And that makes it harder for low-income people who are more likely to use public transportation to get around. So there's a real equity issue there. There's also the environmental issue just of having more cars on the road, emitting more carbon dioxide and not helping our efforts to combat climate change. And then finally, if you're someone who drives, having all these cars on the road just makes more traffic, which is frustrating for us all. So all of those things we take into consideration, and we're a strong yes on this one.
Got it. So, now that you've painted this picture of the effects on, public transit ridership and dropping fare money and emissions and all this sort of stuff, It sounds like there's a lot of hidden costs when it comes to transportation network company Lyft and Uber rides. So the price that we're paying to Lyft and Uber is not covering the whole picture of what the costs are. And those costs are then paid for by society, right? In terms of needing to backfill, the funding that we would have gotten through fares, through other ways, through other taxes. So this is sort of a way for us to recapture some of that and get at the real costs of the ride, right?
Yeah, that's
great.
Absolutely great.
One of the other things that comes to mind around Measure GG is that a lot of opponents are saying that low-income people use Lyft and Uber just as much as anybody else, and so rides will become more expensive for people who need it. So can you talk about sort of the trade-off there between, again, this is a tax that everybody's going to pay, but how does this shake out for people that are on the lower income spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, it's true. This will make the rides more expensive, which is the goal of the tax. And that means that they're going to, be a little bit harder to pay for lower income folks who use these services. But it's really important to remember that lower income folks are also big users of public transportation, which has been hit hard by the growth of these two companies. And so, while it definitely does make the rides on Uber and Lyft that they use a little bit more expensive, hopefully it'll have some positive effects on the public transportation system that will help folks out.
Got it. Yeah. So it's important to remember that the truly most affordable ride that serves the most low-income people is public transit, and we're degrading the efficacy of our public transit system when we're taking away fares and potentially having to have service cuts. That's a helpful way to think about this and frame it. Next, I want to move on to Measure LL, which is one of those ones that makes me think, why is this on the ballot? Can you give us the gist on what this is and why it's even here?
So there's something called the GAN limit, which caps the growth of city budgets. And cities, if they want to spend more than that cap, need to ask the voters every 4 years. And so it's been 4 years since the last time Berkeley voters authorized this increase. And the reason that we're talking about this one today is Berkeley in recent years has passed a real estate transfer tax, which we're a big fan of for creating a sustainable funding source for affordable housing and other local government programs. And so we want to make sure that we come back and are supporting Measure LL so that Berkeley can actually spend that money that they've already collected from that tax.
Wait, so Measure LL isn't a tax. We're not implementing a tax. We're just giving permission to spend money that we've already raised through previous taxes.
Yes, it is.
Doesn't make any sense because passing the taxes was the permission. So why is there even this extra thing?
So this is another relic of the 1970s tax revolt in there with Prop 13, when a bunch of people decided that they wanted to stop paying for public services and, have put these big hurdles in the way of, equitably raising money to fund government programs that are going to help, everyone, in particular people who have more need. So unfortunately, this one is still on the books, and in a lot of cities, kind of on a 4-year basis, you see these types of measures. It's an unfortunate thing that we have to vote on, but important to make sure that it goes through.
Okay, I guess we'll write this one off as just a quirk of direct democracy in California politics.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a quirk like this. I mean, the reason that tax revolt kind of came about in the 70s has some pretty deep racial equity ties to it too. But yeah, it's an echo of that.
Got it. All right, well, let's move on to Measure MM, which has some more substance to it and make some changes to the rent control policy in Berkeley.
Yeah, so this one would make 3 changes to the way rent control works in Berkeley. So the first one is it makes permanent the city's COVID pandemic eviction ban, which makes it so that people can't be evicted for missing rent during the state of emergency surrounding the pandemic. This law is actually already on the books in Berkeley, but this makes it permanent and includes it in the rent control part, which just secures it kind of in the legal foundations for Berkeley even more. The next one, which is near and dear to my and the rest of us at TechEquity's heart, deals with the rental registry in Berkeley. So if you've been to some TechEquity events before, particularly in the spring or summer, you probably heard about our efforts to establish a statewide rental registry. Berkeley has one in its city, but right now it only applies to apartment units that are subject to the rent control laws, which means that the data that rental registry provides, which helps enforce tenant protections and also helps policymakers make smart decisions about housing policy, is missing a big chunk of the rental market. Measure MM would now make those units that are exempt from rent control still participate in the rental registry. So Berkeley would have a much more comprehensive and complete data set on what's going on in their rental market. And
yeah,
it's
so
kind of a pilot for what we're trying to do at the state level.
Yeah, I want to go back to the COVID eviction protection, because I think this is something that's on the mind of many of us. There seems to be this looming eviction crisis where things could start to really crumble for renters if we don't create some policies to bolster them. And the state did do something around eviction protections for renters, but it seems like Measure MN is Berkeley's attempts to sort of fill in the gaps locally. Can you talk about what happened at the state level and what Measure MN is doing that is a little bit different?
Yeah, so the state passed a law, which has already been signed in to effect by Governor Newsom, that does have some renter protections against evictions related to missed rent during the pandemic. But a number of tenant advocates, actually probably most tenant advocates, would say that law didn't go far enough and didn't provide enough protection. But it's important to know that a number of cities, especially in the Bay Area, have passed stronger local laws. And so this is a way of kind of filling in some of the gaps in that state policy, at least for tenants in Berkeley.
Got it. Well, I want to remind everyone that the Q&A continues to be open, so you can feel free to drop any questions that you have about the last couple of measures in Berkeley that we covered, if you have any. And now we're going to move on to the measures in Berkeley for which TechEquity doesn't have a position, but Annie will still give us a brief summary. So let's move on to Berkeley Measure FF.
Yeah, so Measure FF funds some services that are pretty relevant these days: firefighters, emergency medical services, and fire protection. So this comes up with $8.5 million each year to pay firefighters to maintain emergency medical services. So that's like paramedics and ambulances, to keep the 911 system running, and then also to prevent wildfires. And this one is paid for with a 10-cent per square foot property tax increase that would apply to all the properties in Berkeley. Moving on to Measure HH. This one raises money for environmental justice. And so specifically, it will bring in about $2.4 million a year to be used for climate and environmental equity programs. And this is done by raising the tax on utilities, which is your PG&E bill. And so that would go up from 7.5% to 10%. But importantly, it would include exemptions for some low-income households, and that helps deal with some of these regressivity issues that we've talked about on some of these other measures. Next up is Measure II, which is Berkeley's police accountability measure. And so this changes up the structure for police oversight in Berkeley. The Police Accountability Board would replace the current Police Review Commission. It would continue to investigate complaints against officers, but Measure II would give that Police Accountability Board some new powers, including the power to subpoena, to make recommendations on police operations and budgets, to review the agreements that Berkeley Police would make with other police forces like the Alameda County Sheriff, and would also give that board a voice in hiring the police chief in Berkeley. Next up, we have Measure JJ, and this raises pay for mayor in the city council, which sometimes people might be a little suspicious of, but the way that they've decided to do this is to base it on area median income for a family of 3. So that's about $107,000 a year, which is what the mayor's new salary would be. And city council members would come in at about $67,000 to $68,000. Right now, the mayor makes $61,000, and city council members around $39,000, which is not a low income by any means, but also seems a little bit out of step with some of the way that pay and especially costs like housing have gone in the Bay Area. Our final Berkeley one is Measure KK, which is a big grab bag of tweaks to Berkeley's city charter, which is basically like the constitution for the city. So first and foremost, it removes citizenship requirements to serve on the redistricting commission in Berkeley. It also replaces kind of all gendered terminology in there with gender neutral terminology. The city attorney would be appointed to an indefinite term, which basically means the city attorney keeps their job until they resign, or as part of this measure, 5 of the city council members can vote to remove the city attorney. And then, do we still have folks? Did we just lose Megan? Okay, great. Not great that we lost Megan. Great that I'm still talking to you all. Let's finish up Measure KK. And so the last one here removes a restriction on where firefighters can live. They no longer have to live within 40 miles of the city. So with that, we're going to move on from Berkeley and touch on our one other additional local measure, which is down in San Leandro. At least it's down from my point of view in Oakland. So this one touches on a real estate transfer tax, which I mentioned briefly. Uh-oh. Are we on?
I think so.
Oh, okay, great. Sorry, my Zoom just kind of crashed, so I wasn't sure. Okay, so San Leandro, they have a transfer tax increase on the ballot. This is Measure VV, and it would, so let me start with what a transfer tax is. It's basically just a tax that gets paid when a piece of real estate is sold. And so this would raise it from 0.06% or 0.6%, sorry, to 1.1%, which is expected to raise about $4 million for San Leandro each year. And we're a yes on this one. In general, we like real estate transfer taxes. That's a good sustainable funding source. Oh, okay, we still have everyone. So that wraps up our presentation to you on all of these ballot measures. But now we have time for your questions.
Yeah, I just want to apologize to everyone for the technical issues that we're experiencing. Really apologize for a disjointed experience, but hopefully we can recover a little bit in the Q&A portion and have it be smooth sailing from here. Before we jump into Q&A, I just want to tell you all about a couple of ways that you can get involved with TechEquity. The first of which is to tell a friend. We are strengthened as a movement and as a community by having more people on board in the fight for better housing policy and workforce and labor. And we need you and your friends to get involved with us and also to vote. So take the information that you received on this webinar today, spread it around. Herman is going to be sending everyone who was on the webinar today a follow-up email that has links to all of the resources, as well as summaries of the measures that we went over today through our voter guide. So don't just keep that in your inbox, forward that along to some friends, get other people involved. The second thing that you can do is become a member of TechEquity. Ian Eve, as our policy manager, does dozens and dozens of hours of work to research meticulously all of these measures, both in the East Bay, in San Francisco, across the Bay Area, and on a state level. She told me that she did how many words worth of writing this year?
Somewhere around like 15,000.
So we're producing a lot of content to help you understand what's on the ballot, and to do hours and hours of homework so that you're prepared to go into the voting booth. But all of that takes resources. And so we would love it if you can support our organization by becoming a member. If you find value in that type of in-depth research on ballot measures, if you find value in the perspective that we bring as an organization, you can join us as a member for $10 a month or $100 a year. You can join us on our website at techequitycollaborative.org/membership. And so I highly encourage everyone to join us as a member. In addition to helping to support the amazing research work that Ian Eve does and the advocacy work that we do as an organization, and the education events like this one that we put on, you also get amazing privileges as a member, like voting on our endorsements. So you get to weigh in on the positions that we end up taking on the ballot measures, like these ones that we presented today. The final thing you can do is take action with us. We are big supporters of California State Proposition 15, as Ian Eve mentioned, and we have a bunch of volunteer events coming up to make sure that Prop 15 comes to victory and we can reclaim $11.5 billion every year for schools and local services by closing corporate tax loopholes. So take action with us. Herman will provide you in the follow-up email with a couple of ways that you can get involved in that campaign as well. So with that, we're going to finally go to Q&A. And we've got a few going back to the very beginning of the webinar. This one is from Ben, who's asking us about Measure W in Alameda County. Where is that revenue going? Is it to the general fund? Is it earmarked for a specific service? Help us to understand how that money is going to be allocated.
Yeah, so that's an important question. And it also gets kind of complicated. So this one, while the intent of this tax is to put the revenue that it raises towards funds for services for unhoused people in Alameda County, actually doesn't mandate that. And that's because of the way that ballot majority thresholds work, where if you have a tax that has a specific use attached to it, like if you said this money can only be used for those services, the majority that you need to get goes from 50% to 2/3. This is in dispute in the courts right now, to be clear, but still undecided. And so something that cities have been doing, cities and counties have been doing lately, is promising beforehand to spend the money on, kind of what they're promoting the tax for. But technically, it is not legally bound to that use, so that it's easier to pass the tax. It's important to know that.
Thanks for illuminating that, and thanks, Ben, for a great question. That's not something that I would have thought to ask. The next one comes from Mark, who asks if Measure W covers all goods across the board at the higher sales tax, or if it's limited to certain goods.
From what I know, it, excuse me, it would apply to everything that the sales tax applies to currently.
Great.
But if someone knows otherwise, happy to throw it in the chat and I'll let everyone know.
We have another question about the city of Alameda's Measure Z. This one's asking if there's some kind of new density cap that's being put in place, or if it's eliminating this altogether.
So Specifically, what Measure Z does is it repeals the effect of a previous ballot measure, which overlaid that apartment ban and zoning cap and density cap on top of the city's existing zoning rules, which govern basically what and how much you can build in a specific place. So that density cap would go away. And my understanding of it is then that the existing kind of rules about density that are in the zoning code would be the relevant ones. But because of that earlier ballot measure, those are superseded by that 2,000 square feet per unit requirement.
Got it. Well, those are all the questions that we have that are particular to the measures in the Q&A currently. We still have a few minutes left, so if you have questions about any of the measures that we covered, particularly the measures that we've taken positions on, feel free to drop those in the Q&A now, and we can take a couple more before we close out for today. I am seeing a question in the chat, and they're asking if we can access slides later and find more information about what we covered in the webinar today. Yes, you will receive a follow-up email that has the slides and a recording, hopefully without too many gaps for the technical difficulties. If you prefer a written format that's more shareable, all of the information that we've covered has been covered as a part of the many thousands of words that Ian Eve has written within our voter guide, as well as more in-depth blog posts if you want to go even a level deeper on the ballot measures. So we will send out links in a follow-up email for all of those items as well. Great.
Oh, look, there's a couple more questions in here that I think I can field.
Okay, great.
So Measure V, which someone is asking about, is actually only applies to unincorporated areas of Alameda County. So what it means to be unincorporated is you're not a legal city like Oakland, Berkeley, etc. This primarily is dealing with parts of the county that are more to the east. But basically, Measure V would continue sales taxes in that area that fund government services. And then I saw one other question about some organizations to recommend getting more information about Oakland Measure S1. So I want to be clear that these are, organizations that we look to, not necessarily partner organizations where we have kind of like a formal agreement with them, just to make that clear. But there's a few great ones that are working in Oakland. I would recommend the Ella Baker Center, Casa Justa, and also the Anti-Police Terror Project. All are advocates that deal very specifically in this area. And they're the ones that I would be looking to see if they have information on S1. Yeah, anybody else? I have spent months researching these, so please ask. It makes me very happy when you do.
Well, I guess we can end with a fun question, perhaps, which is, let's play if Ian Eve were queen for the day and you could pass any policy on the ballot, what would it be?
So if you happen to tune in for our one from San Francisco last week, we asked this question, I answered, I would like to make San Francisco's borders go away and have it be kind of part of a larger regional government. I'm going to stick with that one and specifically say, as an Oakland resident, I would love to have some say on some of the policy decisions that get made in San Francisco on their board of supervisors, because there has been a tendency. There actually was a good report that came out earlier in the year from one of the local newspapers that showed that as housing production in San Francisco has slowed down, a lot of that slack has had to be picked up by Oakland and other places in the East Bay. And so it seems clear that some of the actions that are going on in other cities in the Bay Area have effect on us in the East Bay. And I think it would be cool if we could have a say in some of those decisions too.
I like that one. Well, with that, I think we can end a couple of minutes early. Everyone be sure to look out for a follow-up email in your inbox, which will include our voter guide. That voter guide includes the measures that we have positions on, as well as summaries of the measures where we don't take a position. So it's really informative and will help you to guide you through casting your ballot. Once again, I encourage you to get involved with TechEquity, tell a friend, become a member for $10 a month, or take action on one of our campaigns. And you'll find information about all of the ways that you can get involved in that follow-up email as well. And so with that, I really appreciate everyone joining us today and hanging in through some technical challenges. And thanks to our resident policy expert, Ian, for giving us the down low on all of these items.
Thanks everyone for joining us.